War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 43, The Drone Wars. This episode is a request from a listener and forced me to look into something that I haven't been following perhaps close enough. Confession time, I'm a bit of a Luddite, and drones, in the most expansive use of the word, have exploded, if you'll pardon the expression, in use during the war in Ukraine. As an infantryman, and really more to the point as the father of infantrymen, seeing half the soldiers being chased down and killed by exploding drones is frankly terrifying. So a brief overview of the history, types, use, and what these all mean for the future of warfare deserve a closer look, so here goes. There are several different types of drones, and the sole shared characteristic is that they are unmanned. This allows them to engage in activities or take risks that a commander, or the human actually involved, would otherwise refuse to do. This expands the opportunities available and can make otherwise immune targets vulnerable. Animals have been, and continue to be, a type of unmanned capability. Soviet dogs were trained to carry mines under tanks during World War II. Incendiary devices attached to bats, hoping they would roost in Japanese houses and cause fires. Even today, dolphins and sea lions are used to guard naval bases and ships. In the automated world, drones operate on land, sea, and air, and under the sea as well. Of course, satellites could be seen as a type of drone, and you could look at the V-1s and V-2s of World War II as a type of drone. Do they need to be guided? Do they need to return? Are they expendable, like a type of ammunition, a guided missile? It would be difficult to assign the word drone to a missile or munition that is pre-targeted, so we will discount these. Additionally, I think anything that is primarily a munition on a one-way mission would likewise not count, per se, as a drone in the more narrow, commonly understood way. So those terrifying kamikazes you see in Ukraine, I don't really consider a drone, rather a type of loitering munition that goes in the general direction of the enemy and hunts down and kills what it can find. This does not discount their usefulness. The low cost and ease of development renders these a conceivable major change to warfare. Thousands of such drones, pre-programmed and autonomous, without need for humans to fly and guide them, could render a traditional airfield a smoldering wreck in moments. Their flight pattern, small size, and small profile also largely renders them impervious to traditional air defense capabilities. Should a defense mechanism become available, would the cost of the defenses be so disproportionate as to make the swarm attack an economic win? An example of this disproportionality are the rocket defenses in Israel today, specifically the Iron Dome, which protects against simple unguided rockets. Each Iron Dome missile costs about $50,000. The munitions they guard against cost less than $1,000. This same principle may apply to defenses against these small one-way munitions. But to the point earlier, a drone or UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle in the strictest definition, would be considered a reusable, remotely piloted vehicle capable of sending real-time video information back to the operator station. The first such use, as noted last week, was in 1982, as the Israelis used their aptly named Scout drone and its immediate competitor, the Mastiff, both born from the lessons of 1973 and the need to scout out heavily defended areas without risking an expensive aircraft and its pilot. The requirements were modest, a 50-kilometer range, 20-pound payload, but critically, the ability to send back real-time information. The aircraft ended up far more capable than initially conceived. Despite weighing only 300 pounds total, they could fly for nearly 8 hours at an altitude of 15,000 feet. Their small size and simple engines made them effectively invisible. A negative might be their slow speed, barely 100 miles per hour. But with Israel's condensed battlefields, this was a negligible issue for them. Their use, combined with the co-produced with America radar decoys, made the 1982 Bekaa Valley air campaign an unprecedented success. The entire well-developed air defense network was wiped out with zero losses to the IDF, with the exception of a lone scout drone. The Syrians lost over 80 aircraft and 36 surface-to-air batteries. The IDF drones were integral to the mission. They relayed information to airborne early warning radars and spoofed manned jets, causing the Syrians to turn on their radars, providing a signal for Israeli jets to use for targeting the batteries. After the near immediate destruction of their ground air defense system, the Syrians launched their fighters. But over every Syrian airbase, there was an Israeli UAV providing real-time information on when the jets took off, how many, and in what direction. The Israelis had well learned the lessons from 1973 and prioritized gaining command of the air by destroying the air defenses first, and then the enemy's aircraft. The use of these drones were essential to the successful accomplishment of this mission. To the regular person, the delay in the United States Air Force to acquire similar technology may be surprising. In fact, it was not the Air Force that drove development of these drones, but the CIA. The primary problem with the drone was twofold. One, it was cheap, and two, it didn't have a pilot. While cheap and unmanned may look attractive outside the Air Force, it was anathema inside of the Pentagon, where expensive and requiring another pilot are the most important facets in determining attractiveness. In 1984, DARPA pushed out a contract for a UAV. All the services, except the Air Force, expressed interest. The Navy was given control working with the CIA, who was the real driver. Eventually, this vehicle known as Amber and a variant known as Nat didn't fly until 1989, despite the lead designer being an Israeli, bringing over his knowledge from the work on the Scout and Mastiff programs. This UAV would eventually become the RQ-1 Predator drone, which was the first officially operating U.S. drone. The specs were impressive. 48 hours of endurance and a ceiling of 25,000 feet. The drone's ability to fly overhead for days gave it operational capabilities refused to manned aircraft. By 2001, the Air Force had 60 Predators, but lost a third of them primarily to weather and icing. Improved engines and adding a de-icing system improved the vehicle's survivability. Originally, these vehicles were explicitly and exclusively used for unarmed reconnaissance. The original designation of RQ, R stood for reconnaissance and Q stood for unmanned. Later Predators were upgraded to allow the carrying of small munitions, and the designation changed to MQ, the M now meaning multi-role. But as the vehicle was never designed to carry munitions, this limited its capabilities. The RQ-9 Reaper, while similar, was far more capable and designed to reflect the now ubiquitous need for armed reconnaissance. The engine was upgraded from 115 horsepower to 950 horsepower, with a threefold increase in speed. These vehicles also started becoming more expensive, with the Reaper coming in at $30 million apiece, while the Predator cost $20 million for 4 aircraft and the ground control station. Again, it was the CIA who insisted on arming drones. The Air Force insisted that munitions be fired by manned aircraft. The CIA went ahead and armed their own UAVs and demonstrated the foolishness of not being able to engage a target with the same aircraft that discovered it. This was a similar situation as in Vietnam, where initially reconnaissance aircraft were all unarmed. Only later was acknowledged that the nature of small wars means small targets. You don't need a jet carrying 10,000 pounds of bombs to hit a single truck or motorcycle. Eventually, several small aircraft in Vietnam, such as Mohawks, Broncos, and Skymasters, were armed with light but sufficient munitions, despite the protestations of the Air Force. The ability of these aircraft, particularly in the permissive environments of Afghanistan and Iraq, cannot be overstated. In my book, the entire operation was predicated on the ability to acquire the use of an MQ-9 Reaper to find the enemy and direct my forces towards them. In the absence of this reconnaissance, the operation could not have happened. The ability to have the unblinking eye in the sky for dozens of hours allows the development of a far better picture of the battlefield than manned aircraft or ground reconnaissance or surveillance can provide. On this note, you will often hear UAVs described as ISR capabilities, so a quick definition of ISR and its components are needed: intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. It is annoying that these three things are lumped together, as they are very different, often requiring different assets. Intelligence is the end product of analyzed information. UAVs cannot provide intelligence. All they can provide is information. The information is critical, but is not, in itself, intelligence. Reconnaissance and surveillance are a bit tricky to define, as they are often confused and used interchangeably. But, for simplicity's sake, in reconnaissance you are looking for something, which requires movement and the ability to scan various sized areas. Because you must move to provide reconnaissance, this puts you at far greater risk of being compromised. In surveillance, you are looking at something. usually a fixed point, such as a base, bridge, tunnel, or other key area. From the ground perspective, a surveillance mission requires movement to get into a position to surveil the objective, but the mission is conducted statically. To add to this confusion, surveillance missions are often called strategic reconnaissance, or SR. UAVs are magnificent due to their long loiter and outstanding optics at surveillance. In fact, and unfortunately, many of the ground surveillance capabilities of the Army have been abandoned due to the growing proliferation of drones. UAVs are capable of reconnaissance, but they have a limited ability to scan wide areas with the precision needed to see everything. They are good at it, but they are not, in my opinion, as good at reconnaissance as surveillance. Accordingly, the dedicated ground reconnaissance assets have largely remained intact. Unfortunately, like the UAV community, the Army often lumps reconnaissance and surveillance assets together, as both compile information for future intelligence, but the equipment and skills required for both are mostly dissimilar. In fact, reconnaissance is a basic combat arms mission that any infantry, cavalry, or armored force could be expected to conduct, while surveillance is a highly specialized mission, often reserved to elite infantry and communication forces, found in the Long-Range Reconnaissance and Surveillance Units, or LRS. These units, with a long history dating back to Vietnam, were eventually dissolved in 2018. I am frankly torn whether these capabilities represent a revolution in warfare or simply a more effective means to conduct some missions while minimizing risk to operators. I tend to the latter. They fly, they have long loiter. It removes the restrictions that requiring a pilot demands, specifically pilot endurance. The autonomous targeting capability of the one-way kamikaze drones replicate guided munitions. The high-capability drones, such as the Reaper and Global Hawk, remain out of reach for most nations. The smaller drones, while terrifying at an individual level, do not possess the capability to sway a battle at this time. The larger the drone, the more capable, but also the more vulnerable. When air forces are no longer led by pilots, you may see the true revolution of the manless Air Force, as prophetically envisioned by Hap Arnold, the father of the U.S. Air Force. What it does do is make weaker powers stronger, as the entry point for legitimate aviation reconnaissance and light strike becomes available to even the poorest country. The presumption of absolute air dominance of a major power is gone. American fighting men have benefited for over 80 years of never fearing what is in the air. In Afghanistan, I never worried about what was above me. I think the miniature cheap drone has changed that. And since the Cold War ended, the U.S. military has completely ignored air defense capabilities, presuming the United States Air Force will always have total control. I fear that this neglect will continue, despite the fact the presumption is now false. The air will be shared with the most primitive of fighting forces, and no amount of F-35s will change this fact. Returning to Afghanistan, my most successful missions were ones that tried to replicate a fighting technique used by the Soviets in the same place, and most famously in Rhodesia with their fire force, only supplanting ground reconnaissance and surveillance with UAVs, where small units with basic technology were able to accomplish stunning results, and a technique we will discuss next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.